Okay, good morning and happy Sunday, and we thank God for another Sunday. And as we just praying just now, and in a time of worship, we are reminded that Christ was thinking about us on the cross, and it's so important to understand and remember the significance of Him thinking about us, each and every single one of us, upon that cross. And the important thing is, what do we do about that? How do we respond? Because the Lord has done it all for us. It is up to us to come to Him and to accept that free gift of salvation, and to turn to Christ. So we thank God for this Sunday. Our message this morning is titled Following God Wholeheartedly. That is the title of this morning's message, Following God Wholeheartedly. And our reading is from two places. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 20 to 40. That's the main passage we're going to go through. It's a bit of a lengthy passage. The other passage we're going to go through is Numbers 13, from verse 26 to 14, verse 24. We're going to jump in and out of that particular passage. The Deuteronomy passage and the Numbers passage are more or less the same thing. They're the same account, so we're going to refer to both of them in and out as we go through this morning's message. The main reason for not following God wholeheartedly, as we'll see in these passages, is that when we have moments of doubt, not trusting God, not trusting God, and fear is one of the main reasons for not following God wholeheartedly. And in this account in Deuteronomy, what we see is that we see both the reward for following God wholeheartedly, no matter the situation, and we see the consequences of not following God wholeheartedly as well. And these are important lessons that we have to take note of in our walk with the Lord. So we're going to see the reward of following God wholeheartedly and also the consequences of not following God wholeheartedly. So we have to look at our walk and our lives and ask ourselves, are we walking in faith or are we walking in fear? Because there is a reward and a consequence for both those situations. So we're going to read Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 20 to 40, and then we'll get into the message. So it says that, okay, then I said to you, this is Moses speaking, you have reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Now, Moses is referring to the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey that God had promised Abraham that he would give to his descendants. So he says, see, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Verse 22. Then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us and bring back a report about the route we are to take and the towns we will come to. The idea seemed good to me, so I selected 12 of you, one man from each tribe. They left and went up into the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and explored it. Verse 25, taking with them some of the fruit of the land, they brought it down to us and reported, it is a good land that the Lord our God is giving us. Verse 26, but you were unwilling to go up. You were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us. So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They say the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there. Then I said to you, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son, all the way you went until you reached this place. Verse 32, in spite of this, you did not trust in the Lord your God, who went ahead of you on your journey, in fire by night and in cloud by day, to search out places for you to camp and to show you the way you should go. Verse 34. When the Lord heard what you said, he was angry and solemnly swore, no one from this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give your ancestors, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh. He will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on. Why? Because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. He followed the Lord wholeheartedly. Verse 37, because of you the Lord became angry with me also and said, you shall not enter it either, but your assistant Joshua, son of Nun, will enter it. Encourage him, because he will lead Israel to inherit it. And the little ones you said will be taken captive, your children who do not yet know good from bad, they will enter the land. I will give it to them, and they will take possession of it. But as for you, turn around, set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. So what we see here is the account of Moses telling the children of Israel what transpired in the past. God had promised them the promised land, the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. And what happened? They came to Moses and said, listen, can we send 12 men from each tribe to go up there to survey the land, to see what the inhabitants look like and what the land is like? When the men went there, they found that the land was fertile. In fact, there was a passage in the scriptures where the grapes in the land were so big that a single bunch of grapes had to be carried on a pole by 2 men on their shoulders. So the land was fertile, the land was good. They agreed that the land was indeed flowing with milk and honey. But the challenge was that they saw the inhabitants of the land, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Anaks, and as a result, the Anakites, they became filled with fear. And because of their fear, they refused to go up and take possession of the land as God had actually instructed them. But what we see here is 2 things. We see that God became angry with them. God became grieved with them because they did not have enough faith in God to trust the Lord to actually go ahead of them, to fight the battle for them so that they can take possession of the land. On the flip side, we see that the Lord was happy with Caleb because Caleb, out of the 12 men, was the only one who believed that they could take possession of the land and that they could overcome the inhabitants, the giants of the land. And as a result, what happened? The Lord rewarded Caleb, and the Lord swore that the generation of the Israelites who did not trust in the Lord, that they would not see the land. So in verse 21, we see that God has made a promise for them to take possession of the land. All right? But he tells them what? He says, do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. That's in verse 21. He says, go and take possession of the land. Go and take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. God is speaking through Moses and telling them not to be afraid and not to be discouraged. Why? Because God realized that they were going to face stronger enemies. He realized that they were going to face fierce battles. They realized, God knew that they were going to actually go through fortified cities. But how did God expect them to succeed? If God knew that they were going to face stronger enemies, bigger enemies, and have to go through fortified cities, how did God expect the Israelites to succeed? Very simply, he expected them to succeed and to take possession of the land by focusing on him, by focusing on his power, by focusing on his faithfulness. God knew that victory would only come from him if they focused on him and not the enemies in that land. What does the Bible tell us? What do scriptures tell us about this? Let's read Matthew 19:26. Matthew 19:26, it says, Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So what we see here is that with God all things are possible. There are some things that we cannot and will never be able to do in and of our own strength. We can only find victory in that situation by focusing on God. Luke 1:37, very similar thing. Luke 1:37, it says that for no word from God will ever fail. So if God is telling the Israelites to go and take possession of the land, he means what he says. His word will never fail. So God gave them an instruction. Go and take possession of the land, because God knew if they focused on him, on his power and his faithfulness, the land would become theirs. And Jeremiah 32:27. Jeremiah 32:27. What does it say? Jeremiah 32:27 says to us, 27 says to us, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Listen to this. Is anything too hard for me? So what we're seeing in these verses is that nothing is impossible with the Lord. And if the Lord gives a word or an instruction or a promise, we have to believe that he will fulfill, he can fulfill on that promise. The question is that, are we willing to believe? Are we willing to accept? And are we willing to obey? What we see here with the children of Israel is that they doubted the Lord. They focused on their enemies, on the inhabitants of the land, instead of focusing on the promises of God. And as a result of that, it led to disobedience and rebellion, and they grieved the heart of God. But Caleb had a different spirit. Caleb saw the power of God, the faithfulness of God, and as a result, he believed that they could take possession of the land. When we look at verse 22 to 28 in Deuteronomy, what do we see? We see that firstly, the men on returning agreed that the land was good. They agreed that the land was indeed flowing with milk and honey. In fact, let's read Numbers 13:23. Numbers 13:23, what does it tell us? Numbers 13:23, again, it's the same story, it's just a different account. It says here, when they reached the valley of Eshcol, okay, so now the 12 men are in the land, they're getting closer to the land now. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. Now listen to this. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That's how big the grapes were on this land. It took 2 men carrying a single cluster of grapes on a pole to show you how fertile, how good the land was. So they agreed when they arrived, and they gave Moses the feedback in the account that indeed the land was flowing with milk and honey. But here's what happened. Instead of focusing on God's promise to give them this land, instead of them focusing on God's promise to give them this land, they quickly shifted focus. They very quickly shifted focus to what? To how much bigger and stronger their enemies were. They shifted the focus to how much bigger and stronger the inhabitants of the land was. And that filled them with fear. Let's read Numbers 13:27. It said here, they came back, in fact, from verse 26. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole of Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. All right? So here, meaning they agree, it's a good land. It's a fertile land. It's an excellent land. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there, so verse 28, what happens is this. They saw that the land was good, but immediately they shifted their focus on the challenges. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The descendants of Anak are the giants. So it's the descendants of the Nephilim, the giants at the time. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites and Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb, verse 30, silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, or we can certainly do it. So we find the other men telling the Israelites assembly that, listen, it's impossible to take hold of the land. Yes, the land is good. Why? Because there are inhabitants bigger and stronger than us. But Caleb, in fact, the Lord said Caleb had a different spirit. Caleb said to them, he silenced the people. in front of Moses says, we should go up there and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. So Caleb had faith. The Israelites were filled with fear, and the fear was so much, and the fear that they had was so great, that the Bible tells us that they saw themselves as grasshoppers compared to the inhabitants of that land, because there were giants in that land at the time. So they were so overcome by the fear, by the size, by the strength of the inhabitants of the land, that they saw themselves as grasshoppers in the presence of the inhabitants of that land. And that is exactly what fear does. Fear takes our focus off the size of God, the power of God, and the faithfulness of God. It keeps us focused on our own ability to address the mountains or the giants before us. And whenever we take our focus off God and focus on those mountains and giants, then what happens is that we too become like grasshoppers before those giants and before those mountains. Numbers 13, verse 33 says, we saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. When we take our eyes off the power of God, the faithfulness of God, and the size of God, and we look at our giants and our mountains, then we too become like grasshoppers. We too seem helpless. We seem completely incapable of overcoming the situation because we have taken our eyes off God. What does Psalm 121, 1-8 tell us? It tells us to take a very, very different perspective. It tells us not to focus on the giants or to focus on the mountains, but to focus on God. Psalm 121, verse 1-8, it says, the psalmist says, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who? The maker of heaven and earth. Verse 3, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going both now and forevermore. So he said at the beginning, he says, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? What we see there is a sense of dejection. He feels overwhelmed by the mountain or the giants that face him. But very quickly, what happens? He shifts his focus to God, and he realizes, hang on a second, my help comes from the Lord, who he's the creator of the heaven and of the earth. And when you compare that mountain to the heavens and of the earth, which are infinite in size, suddenly this giant, this mountain becomes like a grasshopper before God. And we see a change in his attitude. We see a change in his mindset. So the psalmist takes his focus off the mountains and turns to God. And as soon as he shifts his focus to God, his tone changes. He remembers the faithfulness of God. He remembers the goodness of God. He remembers the promises of God. He will not let your foot slip. He will watch over you. He will not slumber, meaning he will not sleep. The Lord watches over you. He is your shade at your right hand. He will not allow the sun to harm you, nor the moon to harm you by night. He will watch over you from all harm, keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. He will watch over your coming and your going. Every moment, the Lord is with him, both now and forevermore. As soon as he took his eye off the mountain or the problem or the situation and focused on God, his entire tone changes. And that's a very, very important lesson that we can learn from here, is to remember and recount the faithfulness of God. No matter what we're going through, because when we recount the faithfulness of God, it fills us with faith. But in Deuteronomy 1 and Numbers 13, sadly, we see that the children of Israel are doing the exact opposite. And what we see is that they focus on the fear, they focus on the mountain, They focus on the giants, they focus on the challenges, and as a result, they are not filled with faith. And that fear we see creates doubt in their hearts. And that doubt leads to rebellion against the instruction of God. God clearly told them to what? Go up and take possession. It was not a suggestion. God is commanding the children of Israel to go up and take possession because God had promised them the land. But because of their focus, they were filled with fear. The fear created doubt. The doubt then led to rebellion and disobedience to the instruction of God. And ultimately, they paid a very heavy price for their rebellion. They paid a very heavy price for their disobedience to God's command to take possession of that land because of their fear and their doubt. And that price was that none from that generation of Israelites made it to the promised land. Instead, God decided that it would be their descendants and their children that would actually go into the promised land, along with Caleb and Joshua. If we look at Numbers 13, 19 to 24, Numbers 13, 19 to 24, what do we read? Numbers 13, 19 to 24, it says here, what kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they on walled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? So this is Moses now giving them instruction in terms of what they need to do. Hang on a second. I think I have missed my chapters here. Sorry, I meant 14. Hang on a second. Okay. All right. Here it is. Numbers 14, 19 to 24. Okay, so now God is angry with the Israelite assembly because they're now afraid and that they're not going to take possession of the land. So he is about to punish them. Then Moses appeals to God's mercy. Then in verse 19, Moses says to the Lord, he says, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people. And that's very, very important. God sees doubt as a sin. It grieves his heart. So Moses tells the Lord, he says, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people. Just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Verse 20, the Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, listen to this, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it, but because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him to the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. So the Israelite assembly paid a very, very heavy price for doubting God, for allowing fear to take over their hearts and their minds, and for rebelling against the instructions of God. The important lesson here is that our focus either creates fear or faith, not both. And the very, very important thing that we must learn from this is that fear can lead us to doubt God. It can lead us to disobey God. It can lead us to rebel against God. And God views this extremely seriously. As we read in this account here, that assembly never made it to the promised land. Hundreds of thousands of Israelites got old and died without actually making it to the promised land. And only one man, Caleb and Joshua, and the descendants of that generation made it. We see the same thing again and again and again. With Noah, we spoke about last week. God is looking for a remnant, a people that will trust him. And God will not reconsider taking a man out of millions, a man out of billions, a few people out of billions, if they are the ones who follow him wholeheartedly. That is what the Lord is looking for. By focusing on the power and the size of their enemies, we see that the children of Israel saw themselves as grasshoppers. And because of that, they lacked the courage to go ahead as God had instructed them. Because of their lack of faith in God, what happened? They could not follow God wholeheartedly. And we see that same word in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, following God wholeheartedly. But because of their lack of faith and their fear, the children of Israel could not follow God wholeheartedly. And because they doubted the power of God, the greatness of God, the faithfulness of God, they forgot all the miracles that God had done for them in Egypt, in the Red Sea, how God had delivered them from slavery. They had forgotten all about that. They doubted the power of God and the faithfulness of God. What happens is that they were effectively turning their backs to God. And that is what grieved the Lord. And the important lesson here for us is that as long as our fears, our situations, our giants is our focus, then what we are doing in that moment is that we are turning our backs to the power of God, the promises of God, and the faithfulness of God to his children. God, he has promised his children that he will never leave us nor forsake us. So here's a very simple illustration. Here is God, here's our challenges. If our focus is here, our problems, our challenges, our giants, we are effectively turning our backs to the promises of God, the faithfulness of God, and the power of God. And what happens is that anxiety and worry take over and not faith. Well, you see, instead, as the children of Israel focused on the power of God and the faithfulness of God, what would have happened is that it is their enemies that would have seemed like grasshoppers to God. Had they focused on and remembered all that God had done for them in Egypt, in the wilderness, how God had provided for them in the wilderness, how God was literally a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day to lead them in the desert, how God had literally sent manna from heaven to feed them, had God had literally parted the Red Sea for them to walk through, they would not have been filled with fear but faith. And if they were filled with faith and they remembered the goodness and the power of God, it is the giants that would have seemed like grasshoppers in the presence of God. And we see a very great example of this in the story of David. What did David, a mere boy, what did he say when he had to face Goliath, who was a giant as well? The entire Israelite army was afraid of Goliath, a giant. But what did David, a mere boy, a little boy, what did he say to Goliath? What did David say to Goliath? So the entire Israelite army was afraid of Goliath, this huge giant. He had armor on, he had spears, he carried a sword, and the whole army was afraid of Goliath. But what did David, a little boy, say when he approached Goliath? Let's read 1 Samuel 17, 32 to 37. It says, David said to Saul, that's King Saul at the time, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Goliath was a Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. He carries on. Saul replied, said to David, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man. And he has been a warrior from his youth. So Saul is telling David, listen, you cannot face Goliath. You can't face this giant. You're a small man, you're a small boy. But Goliath has been a warrior, has been fighting from his youth. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. David reminded Saul that the key to his success did not lie in anywhere else but God. He was a little boy facing a giant that was more experienced than him, bigger than him. And yet, even though the entire Israelite army was afraid of this giant, David refused to be afraid. David kept his focus on the Lord. And what happened? In David's eyes, Goliath became like the grasshopper. The Israelite army had focused on Goliath, so they became the grasshoppers. But David, a little boy, what a relationship with God. And I'm going to talk about that. It's very, very important. David kept his focus on the Lord, on the faithfulness of God, on the power of God. And because of that, he was filled with faith enough to approach Goliath confidently, courageously, and boldly. Look at what he says again. Verse 37. David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will what? Will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So what we see in 1 Samuel 17 is a young boy, a young David, reminding himself of the faithfulness of God in the past. Because he knew that the lion that he killed and the bear that he killed wasn't because of him. It was because of the goodness of God to him, the presence of God with him, the faithfulness of God to him. So he understood if God was faithful then, God is going to be faithful now. And this filled David with faith. David was full of faith. He was so full of faith, he was not even afraid of Goliath. He said something very interesting to Goliath. What did he say to Goliath just before the battle began? 1 Samuel 17:45. What did he say to Goliath? Let's go back a bit. So when David confronts Goliath, verse 42 says, so he, that is Goliath, looked David over. So Goliath looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy. So Goliath is looking at David, he's looking down at David and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. Goliath despised David. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Verse 44, come here, he said, I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. So Goliath was 100% sure that he was going to utterly destroy David. Verse 45, interesting. David said to the Philistine, listen to this. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give your carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is what? Is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. David was so full of courage and boldness and faith in God that he tells Goliath he tells Goliath, a giant, that this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. While the whole Israelite army was cowering on the side, terrified, this little boy understood who was behind him. He understood that he had the presence of God with him. He understood that he could rely on the faithfulness of God. And because of that, Goliath became like a grasshopper in David's eyes. Why? Because David, I beg your pardon, was comparing Goliath to the Lord. And this is why David could be bold and confident. David focused on the Lord. And because of that, Goliath became like a grasshopper in his eyes. Let's read the account of David's victory. Verse 48. As the Philistine, that is Goliath, moved closer to attack him, what happened? David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. See, David didn't even run back. David ran towards Goliath. We see the children of Israel had run away from their giants because they had doubt, they had fear, and they rebelled against God. But David, because he focused on the goodness and the power of God, he ran to his giant. He says, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Verse 49, reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung the stone and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine, that is Goliath, with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. The sword and the spears and the armor represents human effort. The Bible says, what if we have faith as small as a mustard seed? Faith as small as a mustard seed. All David needed to take down Goliath was a simple stone and a sling. But it is more significant than that. What propelled David's success was the faith he had in God. He knew that God could use anything to achieve victory for him. You see, with human eyes, David did not stand a chance. If we look at it from a human perspective, David did not stand a chance. He was out of his depth, and he seemed destined to be utterly destroyed by Goliath. In fact, Goliath said to David, when he saw David, he looked David over and said, "Do you think I'm a dog?" Goliath was convinced that he was going to destroy David completely. But you see, David chose not to see the situation with human eyes. He chose to focus his eyes, using the eyes of faith, on what? On the awesome and the powerful and the faithfulness of God. And that shifted his mindset. It shifted his perspective. It filled him with faith, and God did the rest. What does the Bible tell us about the power of God? What do the scriptures tell us about the power and the faithfulness of God? Jeremiah 32:17 says, "Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." Nothing is too hard for you. Nothing is too hard for you. Ephesians 6:10. Ephesians 6:10 says to us what? Finally, be strong in what? In the Lord and in his mighty power. The strength in the midst of our battles do not come from us. It comes from the Lord. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Psalm 73, verse 26. What does it say? It says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." And we see this in the account of David. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God, the Lord, is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And when we read Isaiah 41:10, what does God tell us? What does he promise us? He tells us, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. I will strengthen you, and I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. This is what God is saying in his word. And even though he's saying it in the book of Isaiah, we can apply this because we can trust in the character and the faithfulness of God to us. Do not fear. Why? Because I am with you. God is with us. Don't be dismayed. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. He is our God. He is a personal God. He's not just in heaven somewhere. He is with us. He is close to us. I am your God. And because I am your God, I'm going to give you the strength. I'm going to give you the assistance. I'm going to make sure you stand firm with what? With his right hand. And if God says it, we need to believe it. What the children of Israel did wrong is that they chose not to believe in the faithfulness of God. What are these verses saying to us effectively? They're saying to us, first of all, that nothing is too hard for God. Nothing is too hard for God. In fact, God himself says it. He's the creator of the heavens and of the earth. Is there anything too hard for me? But what happens is that we don't recall the faithfulness of God in the past. And when we're in a particular challenge or situation that faces us, we become overwhelmed. And we assume for some reason that God somehow cannot deal with this situation. That God somehow does not have the power or the ability to take us through the situation. That even though he's helped us in the past, that somehow this particular situation is too much for God to handle. And there's a saying that goes that what God cannot do does not yet exist. He is the God of all mankind. He's the creator of the heavens and of the earth. He says it. Is anything too hard for him? These verses are telling us that no matter the giant that we face, the first place that we have to go to for strength, for direction, for wisdom is God. No matter what we face, the first place we go to before anywhere else for strength, for direction, for wisdom is the Lord. And thirdly, that we can stand upon the promises of God to strengthen us, to uphold us, and to help us. We see Caleb had a different spirit. And because he had a different spirit, the Lord rewarded Caleb by allowing him to see the promised land. We see David also had a different spirit. He didn't see Goliath the giant. His focus was on God. The size of God, the goodness of God, the power of God, the faithfulness of God. And the more he focused upon that, the smaller and smaller and smaller Goliath became. Well, we see the story of the children of Israel, and the Israelite army is different. The children of Israel were afraid of the inhabitants of the land. They took their focus off God and focused on the giants. And as long as it is the giants that we focus on, we are turning our backs to God at that moment. We saw that the Israelite army were terrified of Goliath. And because of that, they could not face the Philistine army. But God used a boy. He used a small boy, a little boy, to show them that those who know their God will be strong and will carry out great exploits, as the Bible tells us. What Caleb did and what David did, the faith that they have in God to be able to achieve what they achieved and to persevere is not possible unless they had a relationship with God. We cannot have the faith we need in the midst of crisis unless we first have a relationship with God through Jesus. It is impossible. It is impossible. Young David knew God. He understood the character of God. He understood the God that he served. He had a relationship with God, and that was the reason why he could be so bold and be so courageous. And the Bible tells us in Daniel, in the book of Daniel, the Bible tells us, it says to us that those who know their God, those who know their God will what? They will be strong and will carry out great exploits. Knowing there signifies relationship. When we come to understand the nature of God, the character of God, the faithfulness of God, when we play back how faithful God has been to us in the past, it allows us to be strong in the midst of whatever we're going through. It allows us to keep our faith in the midst of what we're going through. But if we don't know God as we should, if we don't play back his faithfulness as we should, if we take our focus off him and keep our focus on the challenges or the crisis, all we are filled with is nothing but fear, anxiety, and not faith. And when we are filled with fear and anxiety, it leads to doubt. And doubt grieves the heart of God. We see that if we jump to Deuteronomy 1:26, because of their fear, what happened? Moses tells them, he says, "But you were unwilling to go up. Unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God." Rebelled. "You grumbled in your tents." So you see that they were unwilling, they rebelled, they grumbled. So even though God had been good to them, even though God had miraculously delivered them, even though God had been faithful to them, they were unwilling to obey God. They rebelled against the instructions of God, and they grumbled. Look at what they said. They said, "The Lord hates us." Those are strong words. The children of Israel are so ungrateful. They said, "The Lord hates us." So what? He brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. And so often we are the same way. We forget the goodness of God in the past, and then we grumble in the midst of our crisis. This is the same God who delivered them from slavery after hundreds of years under Egyptian authority. The same God who parted the sea for them so that they could walk through. The same God who gave them manna from heaven. The same God who worked ahead of them as fire by night and cloud by day. They switch around and suddenly say, "No, the Lord hates us." So we must be careful. We must be careful. Because not only does fear lead to doubt and disobedience, it can cause us to grumble and have an attitude of ingratitude towards God. They said, "Where can we go? Our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear." That's a key word there. They say, "The people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there." See what Moses does. Verse 29. "Then I," that is Moses, "said to you, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord carried you as a father carries his son all the way you went until you reached this place." So when they are being afraid, when they are taking their focus off God, Moses is trying to redirect their focus back to God. He's telling them that what the Lord is going to go ahead of them. So the battle is not theirs. God is going to go ahead. So when God says to them, go and take possession of the land, God has already gone ahead of them. God is going to fight for them. And Moses reminds them that God will do the same thing he did in Egypt before their very eyes, even in the same situation. He even appeals to their situation. He even appeals and tells them, he reminds them of the tender nature and the mercies of God. He refers to God as a father who carries his son all the way you went until you reach this place. He used a picture of a father carrying his child, his son, constantly, never leaving the son, never dropping the son. And that shows intimacy. It shows love. It shows mercy. It shows concern. It shows the protective nature of God towards this rebellious people. But what happened? In spite of everything that Moses said, in spite of everything that God had done, verse 32 tells us, in spite of this, you did not trust in the Lord your God. The Lord your God who went ahead of you on journey in fire by night and in cloud by day, to search out places for you to camp and to show you the way you should go. Moses was trying to remind them that God is a God of the impossible. He's trying to remind them that God was the one who made a way where there seemed to be no way. He's trying to remind them that God was faithful then. They can count on God to be faithful now. There's two lessons here, and then we'll close. When we go through crisis, when we go through trials, when we go through challenges, are we going to be like the children of Israel in the situation? Or are we going to be like Caleb and be like David? Are we going to turn to God and remind ourselves of the goodness of God, the power of God, the faithfulness of God? And in that case, allow our situations to seem like a grasshopper, to be small compared to how big our God is? Or are we going to focus on the situation and be overcome by fear and doubt? And in that case, we become like grasshoppers in the face of that situation, and then we turn our backs to the goodness of God. Remember, there was a reward for Caleb for following God wholeheartedly. Caleb was rewarded for following God wholeheartedly. David was rewarded for following God wholeheartedly. There was battles, yes. There will be battles, yes. But the Lord goes ahead of us. The Lord fights for us. And the Lord is faithful to his children. So in every situation we have a choice to be like David and Caleb, or to be like the children of Israel. One posture will fill us with faith, the more we focus on the goodness of God, and the other posture will fill us with fear and doubt. And that grieves the heart of God. God does not take that lightly. Because when we do that, we are saying that God is not big enough to deal with our situation. We're saying that God's purpose is not ideal enough to take us to that purpose. We're saying that God is not able to deal with that situation. And that grieves the heart of God, because he himself has said that, is there anything too hard for him? So in closing, nothing is too hard for God. If he hasn't done it yet, it doesn't mean he hasn't done it or he can't do it. It means that he might have a different plan for us, or there's a different place that he's taking us to. And all we need to do is wait and be patient. No matter what we go through, the first place that we must turn to is the Lord. For strength, for help, and for wisdom. Let's pray.